Hello one and all, and thank you for joining us and staying with us for our first Google Plus Hangout with Federal Member for North Sydney and Shadow Treasurer, the Honourable Joe Hockey. Now, between the 9th of November and the 3rd of December this year, thanks to Deakin MBA, Australians from across the nation put up questions on oursay.org and voted for the ones they wanted answered by Mr. Hockey. Now, there have been almost 10,000 votes posted across 137 questions, and we're joined today by the authors of the 5 most voted for questions. Now, we're joining you from Deakin Broadcast Studios in Burwood, Victoria, powered by the technical team and students of Deakin's Film and Television course. As we broadcast live on YouTube and Google+, and with special thanks to our media partners, Sky News Australia, whom I work for, we are also being live simulcast on Sky News 604. Mr. Hockey, it's great to have you with us.
Terrific to be here, Peter.
No better day to travel to Melbourne rather than answer journalist questions after Mr. Pine's comment that you would have had the budget in surplus for 5 years straight.
Right. Can't say I'm not up for scrutiny. Here I am.
Well, one quick question from me before we go to our
this is not part of the
question.
This is not part of the brief.
This is the ad-lib section. So, is your view that you would have, you know, as Mr. Pine said, had 5 surpluses straight over the last 5 years?
Oh, look, you can't speculate on what would have happened over the last few years. Clearly, the bottom line is we would have done things a little differently. Unquestionably, 2008, as the GFC hit, had an impact on revenues and had an impact on the budget, but the bottom line was at that time, we said the government spent too much money on the GFC at the same time as the Reserve Bank cut interest rates, and we would have had a very different outcome, but I'm not necessarily saying surpluses for 5 years. I mean, you couldn't speculate on it.
All right, well, who knows? We'll see if one of the questions goes in that general vein, but obviously posted before now, they won't be exactly that. Now, as you can see on our broadcast, we're joined here in the Hangout by those who have asked the 5 most voted for questions. Firstly, we have Ricky Campbell-Allen from the Centre of New Public Education, who received 802 votes for her question on oursay.org. We're also joined by, hopefully we're joined by Peter Evans. We've been having some technical difficulties. We'll see how we go. Peter's in Canberra. He had the second most votes for his question with 1,277 votes. We're also joined, thirdly, by Daniel Carr. Now, Daniel is a business and history teacher from regional Victoria. Daniel holds an economics and commerce degree, and he's served on the board of the business, economics and law faculty of his university. He's now a business and history teacher in regional Victoria. Heather Neal is our 4th participant. She's the CEO of the RSPCA Australia, and she managed to garner 758 votes for her question. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the RSPCA, a position that she's held since 2006. Now, RSPCA Australia has been campaigning long and hard to end the live export of animals for more than 30 years in this country, certainly the slaughter of them. We'll see what she has to say. Now, finally, we'll be finishing off the broadcast with the most voted for question on the oursay.org platform, you won't be surprised to know, and that's been asked by John Klopperoger. Now, he took the lead with a staggering 3,330 votes for his questions, almost 3 times the second highest amount, so we'll be sure and get to him before we finish this broadcast. Now, to begin with, we start with Ricky Campbell-Allen from Victoria. Now, as mentioned, Ricky is the director of the Public Education Forum. Now, we're going to go to her now for her first question. Ricky, what would you like to ask Mr. Hockey?
Good evening, Mr. Hockey. It's great to be talking to my federal member about education.
I could have stayed in the electorate and had your question asked.
I know, indeed. In 2001, the coalition government prioritised education funding to where it was needed most, areas of educational disadvantage. In the future, would a coalition government, how would it seek to address educational disadvantage so that all kids have the opportunity for a great education?
Well, it's a good question, Ricky. We've always seen education as equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcome. I think that's a hugely important starting principle. And because it is about opportunity, it's hugely important that you have pretty consistent access to educational services across the country. We did a lot of work in Indigenous communities, and that was a huge issue, and still is a huge issue, I might add. But that's one of the reasons why we introduced literacy and numeracy tests across the country. The current government, to be fair to them, have built on some of that, but we're still waiting at the moment to find out where they head to in relation to the Gonski reforms before we can release our specific policy on school education. It does matter because there are very significant funding discrepancies. We want to increase the funding for school education on the current basis. The government wants to rearrange it and follow the recommendations of the Gonski review, which the states haven't signed up to yet. So therefore there is an air of tremendous uncertainty about the direction it might take. And after it's taken a specific direction, we'll release our education policy.
Mr. Hockey, I'm going to give Ricky a chance to respond in a moment, but just for some context. Well, firstly, you got to love the irony, by the way, with my first question about Mr. Pine, that your first question is now on his portfolio area of education. But putting that to one side, it's interesting because Ricky nominated 2001 as the moment at which the previous coalition government upped education towards the disadvantaged end of the spectrum. Yeah. But in '96, when you came into government, there was large slashing of education spending, particularly for higher education.
That was higher education. There's been a 40% increase in education funding over the last few years, and the argument is that our standards have been dropping. So sometimes it's not just about the funding levels. I think they're important, but it is important about how you approach the system. Now, we believe very strongly, and we went to the last election and we're going to the next election, with a policy that focuses on giving principals in school education greater power over their school. Now, my children go to a public school, a primary public school. We didn't realise it, but it was our local principal that only introduced advancement classes, and she did that in the last 3 years. And it was her initiative, and obviously now that there is greater empowerment in New South Wales schools, principals with more responsibility are actually engaging more in how they can improve the quality of outcomes in the school. One of the challenges we have is the departments still get it wrong. And the interesting thing, because Ricky comes from my electorate, I can say this. Some years ago, the Department of Education New South Wales did an assessment of demand for public schools on the North Shore of Sydney and found, and they used an input, women having children at the same reproduction age as in Western Sydney. Well, because there's a different demographic on the North Shore of Sydney, we now have schools, I heard today, of one primary school that has 170 students starting in one kindergarten next year, and they're 54 classrooms short on the Lower North Shore. So if the department's getting those demographics wrong just in my little patch, you can imagine how wrong they're getting it in other parts of the country as well. And I think what we've got to do is get the fundamentals right, empower the principals, because they're the ones that can see the changes faster than the department.
All right, Ricky, just a quick opportunity to ask a secondary question to Mr. Hockey.
Certainly. So I'm very interested in the idea of getting the fundamentals right around teacher quality, principal autonomy, greater parental engagement with schools. But at this core, and I guess at the core of the Gonski recommendations, was this idea that our current funding model is inconsistent and ineffective in some ways. And there seems to be growing consensus around that, because we know that up to 50% of non-government schools aren't funded at their SES score, if you like. And we know that we've got around about 18 different funding models. So there is this, it's kind of like we're applying this system, but really inconsistently. So at a base level, it seems like we should be cleaning it up. So I was wondering, in terms of where the coalition's going, on whether they are committed, regardless of extra funding levels or questions about what you do with the money, is it worth fixing up the current system just so that it actually works more efficiently, so we can focus on what really matters, which is what we do with the money?
Look, it's a good question. I'm all for more efficient delivery of funding, and I can see the discrepancies in my own area. And when you have some of the premier GPS schools and the amount of money they're spending, it is difficult. When I also have some high schools in my area that are doing it pretty tough. But I'd say to you, there is no single solution for the thousands and thousands of schools across Australia. There is no single answer. I went to an independent school this morning, and I must say that the quality of the classrooms was just, I thought I was quite stunned. I mean, demountables were a luxury compared to what they had. And that was a small Catholic primary school in my area that has huge problems and charges $3,500 a year for an education. And, you know, I'm all for finding ways to do it better, but we're not going to throw the funding model out the window because there are discrepancies there.
All right, thanks very much, Joe Hockey, and thank you to you as well, Ricky. Now, our second person asking questions, we've had some technical difficulties. It's Peter Evans, who was supposed to be joining us from Queensland. That's no reflection on the state, of course. Now, Peter, I'm going to read out Peter's question. Peter suffers from a neurological illness, which I'm not going to mispronounce here for you, but its acronym is ME. Now, he was a lawyer, but because of this illness, he's been unable to continue practicing in his profession. Now, he held the position of head of the Queensland ME Association for 7 years, and he continues to fundraise for them as well for the Hunter Foundation, which is the main medical research foundation for ME. Now, Peter's question, it was the second highest voted for question on OurSay.org with 1,277 votes. Mr. Hockey, this is Peter's question. I hope I can do it justice with any follow-up discussion, given that we've lost him technically now. It is, in a 2002 report, the Royal Australasian College of Physicians estimated that ME could affect up to 0.7% of the population. That's about 160,000 Australians. Now, despite this, the National Health and Medical Research Council has only ever funded one major biological project into the illness. Will the coalition require the National Health and Medical Research Council to do more?
Well, I mean, for those that aren't aware, I understand ME is chronic fatigue syndrome. I had a member of my family suffer chronic fatigue, so it was easy to dismiss under the old name as a bogus affliction, but it's not. It's actually very serious. And the answer is, one of the great challenges in relation, and to be fair, it's, you know, the same under the other mob as it is under Labor as it is under us, is that you have to have the proposals that stack up for medical research. Now, from our perspective, if there is a good research project in relation to chronic fatigue, or ME as it's known, then that is a good thing to pursue. There are many areas. We in government doubled the funding for medical research. The current government wanted or tried to get away, and you'll remember this, they tried to get away with cutting it before, I think the last budget or the budget before. They were trying to cut medical research funding. There's no argument there's some waste that could be better applied in areas. I mean, they've you know, I only saw a report in the last few days that the government's giving $25 million, $24.25 million for a research grant dedicated to examining how people's behaviour in Europe between 1100 and 1800 reflected on modern Australia.
But Mr. Hockey, I guess going to the heart of Peter's question, though, I think the heart of it is this. He's wondering whether, given the significance of this illness, you know, a report back in 2002, presumably the numbers have gone up, that 160,000 Australians suffer from this, yet the relevant peak body, the National Health and Medical Research Council, has only ever funded one major biological project. I think we can assume, or let's assume for the sake of this discussion, that there have been countless proposals, but only one ever funded.
Well, if there is, yes, you're right. If there have been countless proposals and quality proposals, then yes, that should be funded. Of course it should. But, and it would seem that it's odd that it hasn't, because it is an affliction. It's a very real affliction that affects significant numbers. But the question for me is, you know, have people, and I don't know the answer to this, have people put in detailed research submissions. And you, as a professor at university, you would know that it all depends on the quality of the submission. Well, so much depends on the quality of submission is what it's about. Now, if you can get $24 million for research on, you know, European history, 1100 to 1800, I mean, for crying out loud, surely there must be funding for research into.
But just as one very quick final question on behalf of Peter, I mean, Peter Dutton's the Shadow Health spokesperson. Presumably in government he'll be the health spokesperson. I mean, I guess what Peter's looking for here is some sort of political activism rather than just the rhetoric of it sounds bad.
Okay, good point. I will speak to Peter Dutton to try and find out if there have been submissions to the NH and MRC and find out if there have been some. And happy
we'll
to
put you in touch with Peter.
Yep, and we'll follow up and try and get the answers. We'll find the way to do it, and we'll get the answers to you. But I want to make sure there have been, you know, credible submissions. Otherwise, you can't fund something that isn't asked for.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. All right, we're going to move on now to Daniel Carr, who's hanging out with us from regional Victoria. Now, Daniel is an economics and commerce graduate, as mentioned. He's originally from Queensland. Now, during his university days, he coordinated a supplementary economics tuition program and served on the board of the Business, Economics and Law faculty at his university, as mentioned. He's now teaching business and history at a public secondary school in country Victoria, and he recently gained a renewed appreciation for Brisbane winters. In his spare time, he advocates for liberalism, marriage equality, and an Australian republic. Daniel, over to you. You had 537 votes for your question. What is it?
Thanks, Peter. Mr. Hockey, as a member of the Liberal Party, you have fought to protect welfare payments to individuals earning significantly above the median income. You promised to scrap a market-based emissions trading scheme in favour of a government pick-a-winner approach. You proposed weak export deregulation and gay marriage. What does the party offer a Liberal as distinct from a Conservative voter?
Well, it's a good question. The Liberal Party is a broad church, as it was once described. Well, John Howard described it as that. And Liberal values mean that people accept more personal responsibility for their actions. Now, for example, the Liberal Party said up front in relation to the internet filter that that was a bad idea. We argued not just for free speech, but for parental responsibility. And we were prepared to invest in helping parents to get the tools. But the government's view was you've got to try and control the information flow. Another area near and dear to Peter van Onselen's heart, this government is trying to find ways to regulate the media. And it's been a constant source of speculation over the last few months that they're going to try and regulate newspapers. Primarily because they're not happy with the content of the newspapers. Well, we are opposed to it. We are opposed to it even when we had control of the Senate and we could have put legislation through. We didn't do that sort of thing because we fundamentally believe in freedom of speech. And we believe in the right of a person to cross the floor on a vote as well, as Liberals crossed the floor in the last week of Parliament. It was little noticed in the media. But in the Labor Party, if you cross the floor, you're automatically expelled. In relation to entitlements, I feel quite strongly that the age of entitlement globally has come to an end. It is across a range of areas that we can talk about. The level of entitlement in Australia is reasonable. It doesn't mean that you can't have improvements in some areas, but the level as a percentage of GDP is reasonable. But the issue is we need to be ever vigilant not to go beyond our competition in Asia, which is increasing its GDP share on entitlements, and certainly not to go down the path of Europe where there is a massive...
But let me ask you, Mr. Hockey, I mean, some of the things in Daniel's question that he talks about, welfare payments for people that are well above the medium income, the pick-a-winner approach
let's go through each
to
of them,
climate
because
change.
I know it's near and dear to, some at your newspaper. In relation to welfare for people above medium incomes, you would say what happened was when the family tax benefit system was put in place, there was a payment to stay-at-home mums, and that was a replacement for what was a pension that started up years ago. to help stay-at-home mums, to give some women independence. Because in those days, and still today, some men try and control the finances as a form of assault. So there was an introduction of that. Child endowment it was. And secondly, we were providing incentives under the Howard government, whether it was right or wrong. We were providing incentives for families, to help families through the higher cost of living. And therefore, there was a family tax benefit system, which went up to a very high level. But that was because you couldn't, through the tax system, give people lower taxes because they had more children. So you had a payment system that did that.
Right, hold that thought, Mr. Hockey, because I'll give Daniel a chance to follow up, because I'm sure that he wants to get into some specifics as well. Daniel, do you want to follow that up with Mr. Hockey?
Yeah, sure, I do, Peter. Thanks. It seems that the moderates in the party keep getting rolled on issues that come up. Asylum seekers, gay marriage, the emissions trading scheme. Like Scott Morrison recently said he'd get tougher on people coming into Australia on boats. And I'm concerned that there's been a renewed push for bringing back mandatory sentencing for the people smugglers who are really just impoverished Indonesians who don't really know better, coming and manning those boats, and they're completely expendable, as some of the justices presiding over those cases have stated. How is that at all consistent with Liberal values? And if these moderates in the party that are left, many of them are retiring, Mal Washer, Senator Boyce come to mind,
Joe,
what is the purpose of having them there?
Daniel's under the misunderstanding that there's still moderates in the Liberal Party.
There are moderates in the Liberal Party, despite the jibe from Peter van Onselen. Look, the most compassionate thing I think you can do for the party, for example, or for the country, in relation to unlawful boat arrivals, is to find every way you can to stop them. But an example of where we're at is we were not prepared to send children unaccompanied to Malaysia, whereas the government was. And I can say to you that was the view of the Liberal Party, and that was seen by some people as soft, but it was exactly the right decision. Now, the most compassionate thing you can do is stop the boats. And there is no mortgage on compassion, whether you are a Conservative or a small L Liberal. What matters is that you treat human beings fairly, and the best way to do that is to stop the boats. And this government now has a crisis. 30,000 people, over 30,000 people, have come by boat within the 5 years under Labor. It was about 360 in the last 5 or 6 years under us. Now, I can't emphasise that enough. We were the party that offered a free vote in relation to the Republic. We were the party that had a free vote in relation to euthanasia. We were the party that had a free vote in relation to RU 486, the abortion drug. So we are the party that does allow people to express a view. In the Labor Party, you are squashed, and pretty much the same in the Greens as well.
All right, Daniel, thanks for that question. It sounds like me, you won't be too impressed by the answer, but that's all right. We're going to have to move on.
Well, there's more. We can keep going.
No, we're going to run out of time, unfortunately. So we're going to move on to Heather Neal. Now, she's joining us out of the ACT. As already mentioned, she's the CEO of RSPC Australia, and she has been since 2006. Heather, what's your question?
Mr. Hockey, thanks, Peter. There's a growing realisation in Australia that the live export industry is not a sustainable one for Australian producers. If the Coalition was in government, what will you be doing to actually help that transition away from live exports to a meat export industry only?
Well, firstly, let me start by saying I think the RSPCA does a great job, and I try and do everything I can to support the RSPCA personally. I do not agree with you on live exports. I'm sorry to say. I'm not really sorry, because I just don't agree with you on live exports. I understand the live export trade. When it is done properly, it is appropriate. And when there are safeguards in relation to the treatment of the animals, then you need that trade. You need that trade because as a nation we produce enough food for about 60 million people. Obviously, our consumption of themselves is about 23 million people. But I should declare an interest. I have a cattle property in far north Queensland. It does not export live cattle. It's not very big, but it produces cattle for an abattoir, and that meat is exported. But the market demand for refrigerated meat is low, and particularly in Indonesia. There are 8,000 islands in Indonesia, or there's 17,000, but 8,000 inhabited. And a lot of those islands do not have refrigeration. So when we stop the supply of live cattle to those islands, the people go without protein, or they have to get it somewhere else. And therefore, if they get it from somewhere else, there are no appropriate safeguards in relation to the treatment of animals. So I'm a big believer in the export industry of live animals. I want to see proper treatment of the animals. Every farmer does. And to somehow, for some people to suggest, I'm not saying you do, for some people to suggest that farmers don't care about the cattle when they leave the farm gate is just dead wrong. They care passionately about the treatment of their animals. And most farmers would have shed a tear about the treatment of their cattle if it was Four Corners that covered that story for them.
Heather, can I give you a right of reply? Include, if you like, a bit of a comment, because it's an interesting issue, I think, what Joe Hockey just raised about whether or not this idea of there being a lack of refrigeration and a food need in some underdeveloped countries becomes a justification for continuing live exports if you can find, obviously, the most humane way to do it.
I think that there's a few things that Mr. Hockey's said that we do need to just correct the record on, in that I don't think that there would be an example of Australian animals being exported from this country that are being treated just like they would be in Australia. And so I do know Australian producers care, and I know that the people who were the most upset by what they saw on Four Corners in June last year were cattle producers, and particularly those whose animals were probably involved in that trade. But despite the fact that there has been a system put in place, which certainly has led to some changes that are better for animals, we aren't at the position that Australian standards would deliver yet, and I think we're some way away from that in most countries of the world. So I suppose what we're really interested in is what's the coalition going to do, likewise the government, to help give farmers a choice. I think that's where we really need to focus. It should be about choice for farmers right now, and certainly last year northern cattle producers didn't feel they had a choice but to access the live export market. But so what is it that we can do to actually help those producers, say over the next 5 to 10 years, have a choice? And they can take the risk with the live export industry, or they can actually be part of thinking out of the box and addressing those issues about refrigeration and sale, rather than actually saying, today's the day, we'd always do it the way we do today. So I guess what I think the RSPCA is interested in, but the broad Australian community is interested in, is how's the coalition going to help come up with answers for the future and options for farmers, rather than just relying on the live export industry is something we've done for 30 years, so let's just keep it in place.
Joe Hockey?
Well, Heather, farmers don't have options, and Northern Australia has very few options. The vast distances that need to be travelled are, and simply the sparsity of the area and the seasonality of the area means that abattoirs struggle to work. And in fact, there's hardly a working abattoir in Northern Australia. In fact, my local abattoir at Innisfail, I'm a total price taker. There's no option for live cattle exports for me. The butcher in Cairns might take it, but after that there are no abattoirs. And Innisfail, because I haven't got large volumes, treats me poorly. And then after that, you're looking at Townsville. For some of the people further in, they've got some live cattle as an alternative to the abattoir. But there's no abattoirs in Northern Australia, no functioning abattoirs. Even if you were to build those abattoirs, and there's been a lot of speculation about an abattoir in Darwin, which, as it stands, cannot get off the ground, but a large-scale commercial abattoir in Darwin, even then, it cannot deal with the volumes of cattle in Northern Australia. So effectively what the RSPCA is saying is you have to massively reduce your cattle production in Northern Australia, which means a vast number, not just of white fellas, but Indigenous Australians are going to lose jobs. and it is one of the few, apart from mining, one of the few very important industries that keeps regional and remote Australia going. So,
Peter, can I just jump in and just...
I'm sorry about that, but we're just going to have to disagree. We believe in the live cattle industry, live exports of animals, but I accept your point. If it can be done better, let's do it better, and I don't think anyone will want to see it done better than our side. There is not one farmer in the Parliamentary Labor Party, and there are numerous farmers in our side who want to see animals treated appropriately.
Thanks very much, Heather. Is it as simple as this, Joe Hockey, that basically it's a lesser of evils? Concerns over the mistreatment of animals, people try to do the best you can to ensure you don't have that happen, to lost jobs for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in the north, as well as the protein need of underdeveloped nations. Is your argument it's a lesser of evils?
I don't see it as either or. No, I don't accept that. I think you can have appropriate safeguards. But the government, it was, saying this about this government is one of the things that people find hard to believe. But it was the worst public policy decision I have seen, was watching a Four Corners program and then the next morning closing down the live cattle export. I had farmers in tears on the phone because you can only muster at a certain time of the year, which is obviously the dry season. You can only muster the cattle. You put them on trucks. They travel for hours on the trucks to get to Darwin, to get to port, to get onto the ships where they are effectively feedlots on the ships. And there were tens of thousands of cattle that were, or in that case cattle, that were stranded after they'd been mustered. And it was a complete unmitigated disaster, and it had a huge impact in Asia. I mean, Asia said, if we can't rely on you to supply food to us, what can we rely on you for?
All right, well, we're on to our final question now, and we end, unsurprisingly, with the highest voted question on oursay.org, the platform that we've been coming to you with. Now, this question comes from John Koplroga. Now, John is a 29-year-old full-time retail worker living in Griffith, ACT. He was raised in the outer suburbs of Melbourne and has been living with his male partner, whom he met at high school, for over 9 years now. They would dearly like the opportunity to get married one day. He's also a board member of Australian Marriage Equality. Now, John, you received a rather staggering 3,330 votes for your question, almost 3 times the second highest number of votes in this particular survey. Now, how did you get so much support?
Well, through my friends and my networks, we have a huge base of supporters, and people are really passionate about this issue. So there's certainly many, many young people out there that are very passionate about it, and I think that just reflects the amount of support there is community-wide. So we didn't really need to put the message out there very far. There was just many people eager to have this question raised.
Yep. Okay. Well, this has been a discussion that has been well and truly anticipated. So let's get started. What is your exact question for Mr. Hockey?
Sure. Okay. To give a bit of context, so national surveys continually show that a majority of Australians, as many as 64%, believe same-sex couples should be allowed to marry. And your own survey, Mr. Hockey, showed that young people in your electorate, 78% of them supported the reform. So my question is, will you abide by the wishes of your constituents by supporting marriage equality? And if not, will you at least advocate for a free vote for coalition MPs?
Well, let me say, I totally understand where you're coming from, but from my personal perspective, and this isn't going to be great news to you, but from my personal perspective, a marriage is between a man and a woman. My comments have been YouTubed and considered and debated, but that's my personal view. Now, marriage as an institution started as a pagan rite and then became a religious institution, and it was the state that crept into that area, and certainly it was part of the Constitution in 1901 that the Commonwealth should have responsibility in relation to that area. But having said that, from our perspective, you know, the free vote was something the Liberal Party did not consider at the last election. The party felt that it was wrong to go to a free vote in relation to it after pledging at the last election not to have a free vote. That was the view of Julia Gillard as well, but she was rolled by the party. And Penny Wong, who I have a great deal of respect for, also promoted that view that there should not be open votes until the Labor Party decided through a faction system to...
Can I just interrupt and ask you something on that, Mr. Hockey? Because I can understand that. I mean, I've written plenty of times that I'm pro-gay marriage, but I can understand this idea that, you know, you had a position before the election, so therefore you're not going to allow a free vote after it. But if you're serious about wanting to have the free vote on this at some point, isn't it important to go into the next election not pledging to bind your MPs for the next 3 years and to therefore have the capacity to have a truly free vote like what Labor authorised in the current term?
Well, that is something that the party would need to consider.
What's your view?
I think my view on free votes is pretty well known.
So
I don't know what that position is.
Allow for on important issues free votes, but having said that, I respect the view of my colleagues that on this occasion, you know...
But you haven't really answered the question on this one. I'm going to come back to you, John, as well.
It is a difficult question because the emotions run high, and I you know, unfortunately, legislation is black and white, but life is grey. And in relation to this issue, I previously did feel that I was agnostic about the issue, and look, if you know, homosexual couples wanted to marry, then that was a matter for their church and so on.
Sure, but I'm sure that John's going to want to talk particularly to the issue in a moment. But what I just want to establish is, going into the next election next year, is it your preference that the Liberal Party doesn't go into that election saying that its MPs are bound, like they were for this term, to always vote, even in a conscience vote, against gay marriage next time?
You know, my maiden speech, I identified that Liberals should have the right to cross the floor. People can cross the floor if they choose to on this issue, and they have.
But Tony Abbott's argument during this term has been, no, we can't, you know, allow a free vote because we campaigned at the last election saying that we're pro.
We'll see where we get to before the next election. We'll see.
It sounds like there's some movement. Sorry, John, I am coming back to you.
No,
it sounds like there's some movement there. Because I can't believe I can't believe that Tony Abbott would be prepared to allow there to be a free vote after the next election. I suspect he's going to want to campaign on this election the same way he did in 2010 by saying that his MPs are bound, like it or not, even if there is a conscience vote.
Tony has also said that he has found the issue very difficult as well. He has a gay sister, and you know he's been and he's got gay friends as well.
So watch this space leading up to the
next. No, I'm not. Don't try and get a news story out of it. You know, our policy is what it is at the moment. But I do want to emphasise, you know, if I can correct what was the insinuation incorrectly out of Q&A, and that is, I don't think one set of parents are better than a single other set of parents, but what I do think, from my perspective, is the very best outcome for a child is to have a loving mother and a loving father, and after that, you know, we try and hold families, whatever their shape and wherever they come from, whatever their background, in the best interest, hold them together in the best interest of the children.
All right, John, back to you. Let's give you a chance. I mean, your question was far and away the most voted for. So what's your right of reply to Mr. Hockey?
Okay, to follow up on that question about children and the best outcome for children, if you support the proposition that it is good for children to have a supportive and secure environment, then shouldn't children being raised by same-sex couples have the right to that as well, by their parents being able to marry and provide that atmosphere for their children? Or is this a case of you wanting to impose your personal beliefs on parenting on everyone else through the Marriage Act, which itself doesn't even deal with parenting?
Well, from my perspective, look, you know, I'm not going to lie, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I had a case example in my local electorate where a male, obviously a father and a mother had 3 children, aged 10, 8 and 5. Because of the dysfunctionality of the parents, the equivalent of Department of Community Services has said the children are never to be returned to the parents. The 2 older children are going to a single man in his early 40s in foster care, and the younger child is going into the care of a gay couple, a male gay couple in their 40s. Now, I did a double take, and I shouldn't, and it's improper in a political sense to do it, but I did a double take as to whether that was the very best environment for those children to go into. Now, the school principal has reassured me that she's satisfied that it's the best environment, but I still wonder whether I could have found a better environment, and I don't know the couples. So that's why I'm reluctant to pass judgment, but I have to, as a decision maker, I have to pass judgment. The change is the one that flies in the face of the legislation. So what you're asking us to do is to change the laws to accommodate what appears to be a change in the community. I don't believe that the entire community is there. I don't think you'll ever get the entire community, but I think, there's still some way to go, and therefore your personal beliefs have to be used in these sorts of situations, and my personal beliefs are not going to agree with yours, I'm afraid.
Joe Hockey, one final question on this before we run out of time. I mean, at the end of the day, if you take the view that I do, that whether it's 20 years or 50 years or 100 years from now, you look at the change in opinion polling with community attitudes towards gay marriage, it is going to happen eventually. It's a matter of when, not if.
I suspect there will be change.
Okay, well, if that's your view, why penalise the millions of people worldwide in the here and now who just happen to be born now and not, 20 years from now?
Well, because I think marriage is an institution that is in effect larger than government. And for a government to make a decision or a parliament to make a decision, it would need to have on board a broader range of community leaders than what exists at the moment.
But then what you're saying, I know we're running over time, sorry, but then what you're saying that it's more important that we have 80% of people instead of 70% of people supporting gay marriage than that these people who are openly homosexual now get to marry.
I think it's more important on these sort of, very significant social issues to have some form of community consensus.
But it means you're putting community consensus, and the polls show us that it's over a majority, a comfortable over a majority that support it.
Well,
you're putting consensus at this high bar at the expense of the rights of people in the here and now who are gay.
We can only set the benchmarks that we have to live by. And from my perspective, to overturn such, a significant initiative as marriage between a man and a woman, my benchmark is, at what point is there a community consensus that doesn't undermine the institution that so many people have, identified with over such a long period of time, and are they prepared to change their views? Now, I recognise, you're not going to get 100% community, acceptance, and nor do I want to be in a position where you're creating a subclass of Australians. But you've got to get that sort of community consensus, which is bigger than having a single vote in the parliament. You've got to take the community with you on some issues, and I'm not convinced the community's there yet.
All right, Joe Hockey, we're out of time. Appreciate you joining us.
Thanks very much.
That is about all we have time for, but please continue to keep the discussions going online on the comments section of this video blog on OurSay.org. Now, thanks again to everyone who has taken part in the discussion. Ricky, Peter, who wasn't able to be with us, I hope I did your question justice. Daniel, Heather, and John, we appreciate all of your time, and thanks to OurSay, the Deakin MBA, for hosting this event, to Google Plus and YouTube for the technology that has allowed this to happen, and of course to my employer Sky News for their broadcast support. Special thanks to the Deakin technical team and the students who have worked tirelessly here in the studio to make this broadcast a possibility. And to all of you, thank you one and all for watching. and discussing this topic and the many topics we've had online. And finally, a huge thank you to you, Mr. Hockey, for taking your time out to be here in your busy schedule, no doubt today, cleaning up after the likes of Mr. Pine. It's great to have you on board. It's much appreciated. My name is Peter van Onselen. It's been a pleasure trying this new type of discussion with you. That does end our broadcast. It will be available as a video on YouTube in a few moments' time, so please feel free to share there. Thanks again. Bye for now.